Hello and welcome to this special edition of Living Legacy. I'm Kent Davey and I'll be your host today. We have a special guest. He's Mr. Oceanside, Tom Morrow, man who created Living Legacy, did it for about 15 years worth of over and over again programs. My colleague and friend, somebody who I worked with for many years at the North County Times. Tom, welcome to Living Legacy.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you.
Tom, let me take you back. I know you were born in 1939 in Iowa. Kind of briefly, tell us how you got here.
Well, after I graduated from high school, I joined the Navy. After I got out of the Navy, after 4 years in the Navy, I went and
You had gone to Phoenix.
I ended up in Phoenix.
You've told me the story that you ended up in Phoenix and went to work as a police officer. And in the training for the police officer, you got an inkling of your next career.
Well, I worked for the police department for 3.5 years. That's the way I worked my way through college.
Uh-huh.
I only really had one goal in mind, and that was to get a commission. I'd been an enlisted man in the Navy, and when I got to college, I worked, got my degree, and I took journalism education. That's what I got a BA degree in.
Mm-hmm. Tell me the story about how you learned to write leads for news stories.
When I got on the police department, I was going through the academy. They brought over the police reporter for the Phoenix Gazette. He taught us how to write leads for our report writing. The police department wanted as concise as possible. When you're taking a report down from a stolen vehicle or armed robbery or whatever the situation called for, you always had to make a report out. So he said the thing that you need to do is the most important thing is who, what, where, when, and why. Okay. Sometimes how. But if you can get that written down, you'll most of your reports will be satisfactory for taking the case on further. And so that's how I learned, and I did it in an afternoon. He came up, but anyway, he was the police reporter for the Phoenix Gazette. And I started taking journalism courses. The reason why I was able to go to college on the police department was I was on what they called a flying squad.
Okay.
We worked from 6 o'clock in the evening till 2 o'clock in the morning, and we didn't rotate. Most police officers, they would do 3 shifts. You'd be on a day shift for 2 months, and then you go to a night shift and an afternoon shift. But if you were on this flying squad, you didn't have to rotate, which meant that we could go to college. And that's what the police chief wanted. He wanted to get more of his officers educated.
Uh-huh.
So
tell me how you got from the police department to your first journalism job.
I got out of college, graduated, and I got orders to OCS in Pensacola, flight school. I was 27 at the time. I was just right at the edge of being almost too old to go. Anyway, I got down there, got into OCS, and after about a month, they discovered that I had a hearing loss. Well, I knew I had a hearing loss. I got it from when I was on the police department. We go on the firing range, and I'm left-handed. And
yep.
Of course, they said, "Well, why didn't you wear your Mickey Mouses?" I said, "Well, if you're chasing a bad guy down the street, I don't have time to say, wait a minute, hold on while I get it." Anyway, I was a smart aleck on that. Yeah. And anyway, I ended up working. I never told you about this one. When I got out of Pensacola, I needed to get a job because my wife at the time was pregnant with our daughter, and I was really worried. So I took the first job I could find, and it was teaching school in a Florida prison. I was teaching 5th and 6th grade to a bunch of kids that were, the youngest one was 15, the oldest one was 27. And I realized that that was not a good place to be, because in Florida at that time, it was in northern Florida, and I kid you not about this, about half the guys on the staff were members of the Ku Klux Klan. The other half were members of the White Citizen Council. And if you don't know what those two are, look them up, because it was a bad time. This was right at the end of Jim Crow days. So I started looking for a job, and I started answering ads in the Editor and Publisher magazine.
Okay.
And Bob Chandler, who was the editor of the Bend Bulletin in Oregon, wrote me and said, I've got a job that I'd like to try you at if you're interested. It's being managing editor of a small daily in Bend, Oregon, or in Baker, Oregon.
I know that you worked as a journalist in Oregon and then back in Arizona. How'd you get to Oceanside?
Roundabout. Went to Oregon. I worked there for a year. I was there while they were filming in Baker. They were filming the movie Paint Your Wagon, Paramount Pictures. And I got a lot of experience, a lot of photography experience, a lot of feature writing experience. I wanted to get back to Arizona. I got hired by the Associated Press. I worked there. They hired me as a radio and television editor in the Phoenix Bureau of the Associated Press. And I worked there for a year. And I started a little newspaper up in the northern part of Phoenix.
And eventually, I know you come to Escondido and work at the Times Advocate.
I worked at the Times Advocate before I got to Escondido. I worked in Phoenix for 4 years. I had started a newspaper over there. We turned it into a weekly and then a daily. And while I was there, I was editor and publisher, and I did a series of stories that ended up putting a U.S. senator in jail. That's a story in itself. But I was named Suburban Journalist of the Year by the Suburban Newspapers of America. That was my first big notoriety.
Uh-huh. Can you tell me who hired you for the Blade Citizen? How'd you get that job?
Bill Missett.
Tell me about that.
Well, I was up in the valley, up in the Victor Valley, working for a company that owned some weekly newspapers up there. And I had been made publisher of 3 papers, but my main job was supposed to be selling advertising. I was a newspaper man. I was a journalist. I was a writer. I was not a salesman. As I told you earlier, I saw the handwriting on the wall, so I got out. I got out of Dodge before they kicked me out, and I called Bill Missett up because I knew him briefly when I was down here. And I said, I'm looking for a job. And he said, God, he says, I've got a couple of jobs here, but he says, they don't pay very much. I said, will they pay more than unemployment? And Bill said, yeah. And I said, well, I'm your man.
Yep.
So
I know you worked at the Blade Citizen. Eventually, you become the business editor for the Blade Citizen.
After about 6 months, while I was a copy editor, and my job was to paste up pages, on the computer and everything. But I did this feature story on somebody. I can't remember what it was. And Bill and Tom got to talking about it, and they asked me if I'd be interested in being a business editor. I said, sure.
So Rusty Harris then was the managing editor at that point in time.
Yes, he was.
He made you business editor. How long did you do that?
About 3 or 4 years.
Uh-huh. And then after being a business editor, you started something brand new.
I became in the business we call a three-dot column.
Why don't you explain what a three-dot columnist
Three-dot
is?
column is an item column.
You string people's names and events, the social events.
Who's doing what to whom and when and where.
Yeah.
It could be anywhere from one paragraph to 2 or 3 paragraphs, but basically it was getting people's names in the paper.
Who are some of the notable people that you met in the world of Oceanside and did either three-dot columns about or living legacies about?
Well, they both come about the same time. I did a lot of stuff for various groups in town. The Friends of the Library,
Rotary clubs,
Rotary Club.
Lions.
I was interested in doing a lot of history, and
that eventually, towards the end of your journalism career, became, historically speaking, a freelance column. Your history.
Yeah, that came
really late.
A long time after.
Let's jump back to Oceanside. How did Living Legacy start?
I remember Tom Morrow, who was the general manager at KOCT at the time, came to me and he had an idea. He says, I'd like to get some kind of a program going to where we could take advantage of some of the stories of Oceanside. He wanted to get more community involved in the station. And I came up with the idea. I said, what if I talked about I think at the time I was business editor at the paper. And I said, get some of these people that are businessmen and how they got started. The first one I did, well, he got enough money from the city to do 4 shows.
Tom did.
Tom, yeah, yes. First one I did was Marty Schroeder. For those who don't remember, Marty Schroeder was a restaurateur here in town. He had been in the Army during World War II, and he got out. He opened up a restaurant down on Main Street, down in the main part of town. It was just basically a hamburger shop. But he became very popular. He was very involved in the community. And he bought some land out in the valley. And there was nothing out there at that time except cows. And I remember Marty telling me, he says, people thought I was crazy. He built this restaurant out there called Marty's Valley Inn.
Uh-huh.
It was a steakhouse. But he said, people thought I was crazy. And he said, I could still see people. I'd be walking down the street on one side of the highway or one side of the street in downtown. He says people would cross over and get on the other side so they wouldn't have to walk past me. They didn't want to have to talk to me. Well, of course, Marty's Valley Inn was quite successful for a long time. And then he turned it into a motel. He built a motel. And of course, the second one I did was sort of one of the Marines that was here when they opened Camp Pendleton. He was a top sergeant, he was a cook, Pappy, and I can't think of his last name, but he was on Iwo Jima.
Uh-huh.
He was heavily involved in the Marines when they opened up Camp Pendleton. We went to several of the original buildings that were out at Camp Pendleton at the time. And it just went from there. I had a good producer at the time, a fellow by the name of Ted Smith, who was a historian himself. Ted was Dutch. He grew up in Holland. And he was, during World War II, he lived in occupied Holland. And his brother was in part of the underground against the Nazis. And I said, how old were you? He said, well, I was 16 at the time. He says, all they had me doing was I would shuttle rifles back and forth. attach it to my bicycle, and at night I'd ride. They'd capture rifles from the Germans, and he'd take them out to his brother
Mhm.
and the underground people. I remember afterwards, before he immigrated to the United States, he joined the Dutch army. At the time, they still had colonies down in Indonesia,
Mhm.
and that was when they had the uprising down in Indonesia. And he was saying, yeah, when they issued me the uniform, he says I had a couple. This is one of the jackets that they gave me. It had 2 bullet holes in it. He says, and he looked in, and he said there was some blood in there. I said, what? He said, no, they didn't have any new stuff. He said, we just got hand-me-downs.
Yeah.
And anyway, he worked. He did a magnificent job for all the time that I was doing Living Legacies.
You started Living Legacy in the 90s,
Yeah.
and it was a monthly program.
Yes. Yeah.
And your last one that you did was about when?
I'm guessing, but it was probably 07, 08.
Okay. Oceanside at that time was known as Marine Town, and it's changed quite a lot since then.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about that.
During the Vietnam War, the Marine Corps had a tough time with recruits. The quality of the Marine at that time was not the best, and they were getting kids that hadn't graduated from high school, or they were taking anybody that was a warm body. And there was a lot of crime that took place in Oceanside. Oceanside got a reputation of being it was a bad place.
Rough town.
Or it was a rough town. And people, I think today would be interested to know that the Shore Patrol patrolled the streets with the Oceanside Police Department.
Ah.
It was a rough place.
When did you start seeing the change in Oceanside? Because Oceanside now is pretty much a tourist destination.
After 5 to 6 years after the war was over, things started cleaning up. The Chamber of Commerce did all they could to clean up the image. A lot of the things that I wrote about had to do with some of the stuff that Oceanside was doing, the Chamber was doing. We tried to put as good a face on Oceanside as we possibly could. And I'd say that most of the time that I was working for the Blade and the North County Times, Oceanside really was cleaned up nicely. The city did a lot of good things, but people on the outside of Oceanside didn't know anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
I remember going to several different parties over the years, and they'd say, well, where are you from? You know, the people from, shall we say, one of the towns south of us here in Oceanside. They'd say, well, where do you live? I'd say, Oceanside. Oh my God, how could you live in Oceanside? I said, I lived quite nicely in Oceanside, and it's one of the best kept secrets in San Diego County.
You did something to advertise Oceanside. You had a wonderful automobile. Tell me about that automobile.
Well, I had two. My second Lincoln.
It was a black Lincoln Continental.
Well, that was my first one, and then I got a kind of a bright green Lincoln Town Car. And
what were the license plates?
Well, the license plate was Mr. Oceanside.
Mr. Oceanside.
But that title was given to me by the city council, and we might hear from a couple of those members later on, I guess. But somebody from the community nominated me, And I felt kind of embarrassed because at the time, I, knowing all the history of Oceanside that I had, and all the people that I had worked with and the people that helped me along. So one of the real guys that helped me a lot in those early days was John Steiger.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought if anybody in this town needed to have the title of Mr. Oceanside, it should have been John Steiger.
Mm-hmm.
But I was very honored, very humbled to take that title.
Who are some of the other notable Oceanside figures that you came to know and write about, rub elbows with?
Well, we've got Dave Rorick was one that comes to mind. He was a retired car dealer here in Oceanside. His family had been here for years. He told me stories that little things like during World War II. I said, you didn't have, he was a Buick dealer. And I said, you didn't sell many Buicks, did you? And he said, well, no. He said, we did a lot of farm equipment because there was a lot of bean fields out in Camp Pendleton area. But I said, but you weren't able to sell any cars. He said, nobody says we converted the Buicks. They were high compression engines, 8 cylinders.
Right.
And this is before the V8 days. And he says they'd regrind the valves. I don't know how they did it. He explained it to where you could burn regular gas. Mm-hmm. Because in those days, a high compression engine, a Buick, a Cadillac, those kinds, you had to use premium gasoline. Mm-hmm. We called it ethyl, but right. But he said that's how we kept it. I kept my mechanics busy doing that kind of work. So, yeah. Or he says we sold used cars, but he says wasn't a lot of car business in those days.
Yeah. Tom, I'd like to go back to Living Legacy and the impact you think that it had on not only KOCT, but on the City of Oceanside. You must have met dozens and dozens of notable people in the Oceanside community.
Oceanside and Carlsbad and Vista, those 3 cities have been blessed over the years of having notables, people who was involved in a lot of historical events. One guy came in, he was a coast watcher behind the lines in the Philippines during World War II. And he saw a movie with Tyrone Power called America Guerrilla in the Philippines. This guy was in his unit. He knew that, he says, he was my commanding officer. He says, we fought with the guerrillas. And he says, I was a coast watcher along with some Australians. And he said, we were walking, he says, I remember this one event. There was these Japanese battle force came, there were several cruisers and this one big battleship, which was the Yamada, which is the biggest battleship ever built. And he said they were going through the channel. He said, I got on the radio and I radioed it over to our Navy contact that they had been able to get contact with. Ended up, I said, you know what that was? I said that they were headed for the Marianas, mm-hmm. Guam.
Yep.
I said that was the Marianas turkey shoot. Mm-hmm. He says, yeah, that's right, it was. He says, but I tell people about that today, they don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Who else in the Oceanside scene did you talk to during all those 15 years?
First, Glenn Miller, the Glenn Miller Orchestra was one of the most popular orchestras during the 30s. Can't remember his name now, but one of his trombone players is the first trombone player that he hired. He lived in Carlsbad. I said, what position did you play, first, second, or third? He says, no, he says, Glenn played first trombone. He says, I was second trombone. And the lightweight champion of the boxing world boxer, he lived here in town. Got to talking with him.
Do people still stop you and talk to you about
Oh,
Living Legacy?
oh
Tell me
God,
about that.
every once in a while, I'll be shopping in the grocery store, and I'll have people say, "Saw you on TV last night." And of course, I'll always say, "Well, is I any good?"
Uh-huh.
I said, "Who was I interviewing?" And then they'd tell me, and they'd know more about it than what I did. I'd forgotten.
Did for your Living Legacy individual interviews, did you have to do a lot of prep, or did you know most of the people who came on?
A lot of them I knew, and I knew the story, but basically what I always wanted to make sure that I didn't surprise anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to embarrass anybody. So what we'd do is Ted, my producer, would bring him in, and I'd sit down, and we'd be just sitting like we were talking here. So some of them had great stories, some of them not so great stories. General Ray Murray.
Right.
General Ray Murray was one of the most famous unknowns from the Marine Corps. He was known as High Pockets. And it was a nickname that his men gave him.
Mm.
He was on, I think it was Guadalcanal, and Leon Uris was his radioman. Leon Uris wrote the novel.
Right. We're going to have to kind of wrap it up. We've got some people that are going to come say hello to you, Tom. John Daly, Terry Johnson, Jack Feller are all waiting here to say hi and talk a little bit about Living Legacy.
Well, they can come up with names that I've forgotten, because all three of those guys are very important to guys like me in town.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking to us today. Living Legacy is a triumph and a tribute to this community. What you gave us in the oral histories that those Living Legacy episodes represent is just invaluable and will remain so for as long as the digital files exist. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
We'll be right back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of KOCT's Living Legacies with our very special guest, Mr. Tom Morrow, Mr. Oceanside. We're joined now by three very prominent Oceanside residents, former Mayor Terry Johnson, Councilman Jack Feller, and Oceanside historian John Daly. Tom, how did KOCT start?
Well, it was before my time, but a fellow by the name of Bob Bowditch, I believe was his name. It was kind of a hobby. He started worked out of his garage. And that was when cable television was in its infancy. Mm-hmm. And it was a way to get some kind of local television into the area.
Terry, do you know any of the history behind that?
Well, thank you, Ken, and John can back me up. From what I recall, at the time of the council, he had Larry Beckley as the mayor, he had Lucy Chavez in the council, he had Walt Gilbert, Ben Ramsey, and Sam Williamson. And there was a community effort to get the community more involved, to be more informed. And KOCT at the time, when Bob came up with the idea, was a way of doing just that.
Yeah. John, what do you remember about those days?
Well, I think what Terry pointed out was exactly correct. You know, there's few people can go to a city council meeting. Typically, the council chambers will hold 150 people.
Right.
But, you know, at the time this started, probably about 80, 90,000 people in Oceanside obviously can't go there. So this made it accessible for the people that wanted to see it. And from the beginning, when they began operating, it provided that service. And that's just one of the many things they provide.
What do you remember about the KOCT programming, Jack?
I remember seeing it on TV. I wasn't involved with it much, except I kind of watched the elections.
Well, also as a candidate later, though.
Yeah, later I was appreciative of everything that the TV station did for Oceanside, and it carried the elections right away,
Right.
instead of waiting 3 days.
Yeah, election night. Tom, what do you think the legacy of KOCT has been?
I think it's putting forth the various different activities of Oceanside. I mean, the history that we brought for Living Legacies to various different women's groups that would have programs on. It's a variety of things. It's a kind of a microcosm of looking at Oceanside as a spectrum of what's going on in the town. If you want to know what Oceanside is all about or was all about, especially since we no longer have a newspaper, we know that if you want to know what's happening in Oceanside, KOCT is really the only place that you can get local news on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. John, how much of what was available on KOC tracked the growth of Oceanside and the changes? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it. They weren't certainly able to go ahead and cover everything,
Right.
but by the guests they brought in, the people they talked to, the round tables they had opportunity for people to talk about the local area and what was going on. So yeah, that kind of tracked our history as we went along.
Right. As a historian yourself, what's the value of having a library of old footage, old interviews, old recordings of parades, speeches, celebrations in the city?
You know, when you look back at history, oftentimes you're looking back and you're looking for something, and you guys provide all kinds of fodder for that. You had all this information you put together and you've recorded all these years. It's available to us as historians if we're looking for that. So you become another source of information where we're looking for historical facts to find. And like the living legacies you've done with certain people can provide facts and interesting tidbits about Oceanside's history.
Terry, you were on Journalist Roundtable a whole bunch of times.
Like Jack?
Like Jack. What were some of the memories of those interviews?
Wow.
Or Jack, jump in.
I'm telling you, just thinking about the interviews for myself, personal one-on-one with Tim Aldrich and others, just a lot of history. Just a great way to connect and reconnect with people throughout the whole community, because Oceanside is such a diverse city,
Mm-hmm.
and KOCT provides the opportunity for people who could not go downtown to the meetings or go to whatever event to sit in the living room and learn about the city, past, present, and what's going to happen in the future.
Jack, did we do a reasonable job of getting issues out in front of the elections?
Absolutely. The early part of KOCT for me was that probably made a difference for my time in office was early on. KOCT was covering things that we did, the Harbor Days, the Sea Gaze concerts, all the activities. Over the line.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everything that was fun to do really came to a head through KOCT. And I felt like KOCT was taking a big step to broadcast those things. Even though at that time we had the newspaper, it was not the same as seeing the crews out there on the beach. Or
both of you guys, I know, were on Journalist Roundtable.
Yeah.
John, were you ever on Journalist Roundtable? No.
I'm a non-political person.
Okay. Tom?
Happy about that.
Yeah. Tom, tell us about the start of Journalist Roundtable.
As I recall, it was a couple of years after I started Living Legacies. Tom Reeser and I, by the way, this whole driving force of the station in those days, right up until he retired, it has to be given credit to Tom Reeser. He's the one that really kept this thing breathing. But I told him, I said, I'd like to do something that we could get more in depth on what news coverage of what's going on in the community. Kind of talk about, well, we were reporting that the sun also set last night, but why did it set last night? And give a little bit more of the information. And so I talked him into doing the journalist roundtable, and I'd say we started it 95, 96. I can't remember exactly when it was.
Okay.
And then you ended up getting it after you.
Well, I wasn't. You were originally one of the hosts, as I recall.
I was the first host, but I was really not. Basically, I was kind of a ringleader in that I could get everybody else talking, because a lot of the information that I have it wasn't the hard news, so to speak. That I tried to get reporters in that been involved in the story, or what was going on. We'd have maybe one or two primary stories of the week that we would talk about. But
I know Jay Stryker Meyer, to all of us who knew him. Well, he lives in Tennessee now, as I understand.
AKA Rambo.
Yeah, was the host for a while.
Yeah.
I know after him, I came on for a while. Dan McSwain, I think, was the host for a while. Allison St. John was one of the regulars. Logan Jenkins from Union Tribune was a regular. Anybody else that you guys recall as regulars?
It seemed like most all the council members at the time, all through that, wanted to have a little piece of that action. I think it was getting people out there. I know I wanted to throw something out about Tom. Tom was probably instrumental in my port of subs. He took a picture of me holding a 1-foot sandwich and a finish on the front page of the local section, and talked all about me. And I thought, wow, how did I get that kind of publicity? And those kind of things happen when you're doing what KOCT does, and hopefully they can push for that future in the future, those kinds of things, even more so than they do now. Just the local people that are, they may be struggling, but Tom made me feel like, wow, I'm something.
John, what do you think kind of future Oceanside can have with KOCT, and given that we've got kind of a dearth of news organizations, media organizations, there's still some websites that have a little bit of reporting. The Union Tribune does a little bit, but the Blade Citizen's long gone. The North County Times is long gone. What do you think?
Newspapers as we've known them are gone. I mean, even though I get a paper every day digitally, they're pretty much gone.
Yeah.
What you guys can do, I think, better than anybody is you can do things in depth. You don't rely upon the news, because the news cycle right now is every minute.
Right.
It's in my pocket. I look at my phone. I know what's going on all the time. So having the current news is not necessarily a benefit to you guys. What's benefit for KOCT, I believe, is you can do things in depth. So you can pick out your stories and you can do them in more depth. And that's the one beauty of what you guys can do that we'll never see again in newspapers, is in-depth stories. And that's the sad thing for newspapers, I think. The saddest part is missing those exposés, those larger stories about something of interest.
Yeah.
And you guys will be able to do that long after the papers are gone.
Jerry, do you remember some of the conversations, the long conversations we had about Manchester and building hotels in downtown and the fights?
Don't remind me. But when I think about the different battles we fought and shared, and I'm going to digress a little bit back to Tom.
Uh-huh.
I think I think about all the joy that Tom and others that helped him, like Larry Hatter.
Oh,
One
yeah.
time, you guys had a campaign to help raise money for instruments and uniforms and shoes for thousands of students who could not afford the uniforms or the instruments for the band or the shoes.
Yeah.
And Tom Morrow, along with help from Larry Hatter and many others, did a great job down through the decades, helping thousands of students to this day that you did. And kudos to you, Tom, to tell you.
Something that hasn't been mentioned today is you were a bass player and had a band.
Oh, I was.
Oh, the All-Stars.
The All-Stars.
Yeah.
The Oceanside Society Orchestra.
Yes.
That's right.
The two big projects that I got involved with that the column helped drive was at the Rotary Club. Was one we bought instruments for the violins and bass viols for the students at the elementary schools. The second one is we bought 10 defibrillators. Easy for you to say, right? Defibrillators. When I was on the president of the Rotary Club, and that we had a tough time. It was in the early days. We had a tough time getting people at the city to. We wanted to put one in the police cars, on the fire department. We finally got that through, and I can't remember who it was. Jack might remember, but somebody told me, said, well, I had this in the column. They said, well, we should put one in the city council chambers because you never know when somebody's going to have a heart attack today.
I wouldn't doubt.
That's back when Larry Bagley and Melville was going at it, remember?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. What other memories about KOCT or the 3-Dot column that Tom wrote do you guys have? Memorable moments
That we could talk about.
that you can talk about?
Tom's column was always something that you read first.
Mm-hmm.
You went to it first, so it's kudos to him because it was something of more interest than anything else in the paper.
It helped to raise the readership. People look forward to it.
Yeah, it's important to have. I mean, I think it's going to be a sad day that we have no newspapers because the local part of the news is the biggest thing we lose.
Sure.
And Tom was always part of that, and we always look forward to Tom's column.
It's also the reason that as an editor of a newspaper, I always said how important obituaries are.
Yeah.
Get the obituaries in and get them, because everybody reads the obituaries, particularly as they get to my age, and I got to read the obituaries.
I think the saddest thing that has happened in the newspaper business, and it's everywhere now, but the saddest thing that I think is that when they started charging money for obituaries. I mean, the obituary is news. Yep. And it's not something you should have to pay to be put in a newspaper.
Yep.
But that's a personal thing.
Also, keep in mind, Tom Morrow, along with the support of KOCT, were very supportive and very successful in bringing Kevin Cole to Oceanside for, I think, 2 concerts, Tom, for the George Gershwin classical pianist music. He brought classical music, pianist music to Oceanside.
Right. Right.
World renowned.
Well, I came up with this idea of having a music festival, and I was just kind of throwing it out in the column to see who would salute it. And I got a call from a fellow by the name of Hugh Martin in Encinitas. Mm-hmm. Hugh Martin was one of the world's great songwriters, and the most famous song he ever wrote was "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," and the trolley song, "Clang, clang, clang went the trolley." This is for the movie the Meet Me in St. Louis. He lived in Encinitas, and so he said, "Let me try to get you a kid by the name of Kevin Cole, who would do a great job for you as far as being a centerpiece for the entertainment." And we got him in there, and it was some of the more successful events that we had.
Mm.
I think what KOCT still can offer is the same kind of programming that we're talking about. That this could be the news center that more people are looking for.
Right.
I just hope that we've got the support from the council, to increase what they can publish. The council meetings are about as boring a thing as you can watch most of the time,
But they contain the lifeblood of the city's workings in the underland, Terry.
Yeah. Just one more quick point before I forget this. Tom was very instrumental, not in just bringing classical music to Oceanside, but he brought Hollywood to Oceanside. Remember when you brought Herb Jeffries to Oceanside and KOCT filmed it? Herb Jeffries was Hollywood's first black singing cowboy. And I believe at the time he lived somewhere down in Encinitas or Solana Beach. And he was world famous, and he was just a famous actor and singer in Hollywood. And we had him right here in Oceanside. Tom did that.
There's a lot of great stories that I can tell you about Herb Jeffries. I did an article, it was 75 inches. That's a lot. Ken will tell you that that's a story that's way too long to run in a newspaper.
We're just about out of time. So I'd like to ask Terry, do you remember any Living Legacy episodes or stories that seem to be particularly relevant?
Well, speaking for myself in today's political climate,
Yeah.
and how divisive this country is and locally, I think about all the great interviews that Tom did with people that really worked across the aisle and helped build up Oceanside. I'm speaking of Senator Bill Craven, Supervisor John McDonnell, Congressman Ron Packard, Assembly Member Bob Frazee. These were folks who were registered Republicans, but they worked very well with everybody, and we don't have that today. And that's what's missing. I think that's missing.
Yeah. Jack, do you have a Living Legacy episode that you recall?
I just think John Steiger probably.
For our audience, tell us who John Steiger was.
Half the buildings in Oceanside seem to be named after him, but even including a water tank. So
His father. That's his father.
But John was mayor early on,
right?
And he just was always the go-to guy for history for me in my early times, especially when I got roped into being president of Rotary.
He was vice mayor.
Vice mayor? Well, it didn't matter.
John.
Oh, the one I remember the most, of course, is my mother.
Okay.
So my mother was interviewed by Tom, and I thought it was great that they brought a family in that's been here since about 1900, and that's my mom's family. I was able to go ahead and talk to someone that's been around Oceanside for a very long time and has been living the legacy all along. So I was very excited about the one he did for my mom.
Tom, what do you think? The opportunities of living legacy into the future.
There's stories that are available that people don't even know what they have. For instance, remember we made at least three abortive attempts to get hotels built downtown.
Oh, yeah.
One hotel they're going to build. The guy that was going to build the hotel, he was a former football player. NFL.
He played with
Manchester's.
No, he played with the Eagles.
Yes. Well, anyway, you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
He started excavating work down at to get the hotel started, and they come across what had been an old privy.
Yeah.
And they stopped the work and said, "You got to excavate that. You got to call in San Diego State's archaeological department." And he said it couldn't go any further. He said they're going to charge me $24,000 to dig up a crapper.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I want to thank Terry Johnson, Jack Feller, John Daly, and most of all, I'd like to thank Tom Morrow for your contribution to the living legacies of Oceanside, and all of you guys for participating in this conversation, and the heartfelt hope that living legacies for the city of Oceanside goes on indefinitely. I'm your host, Kent Davey. I'd like to thank you for watching very much. This is KOCT.org.
You're watching KOCT Television in Oceanside.